But this is God's plan to have a people unto himself, and he chose Abraham to lead that people, to be the foundation of those people. And then we come to Genesis chapter 13, where the promise is expanded. You'll recall that Abraham had grown in wealth and stature and in property, as had his nephew Lot, so much so that they couldn't cohabitate on the same geography. So the decision came along to separate, move towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham stayed in the valley. And then God renewed and refined and grew the promise that he made to him. And so we see that the relationship is growing. And then by the time we get to Genesis 15, then we see the covenant is then ratified. There was a son that was promised, and there was an actual covenant. I think this is what you guys talked about last week, where you had the animals that were slaughtered, they were separated, and then you had the smoke and the fire moving through those animals to symbolize the covenant. And I think you had a really good discussion with that on last week. So that now then brings us to Genesis chapter 16. Now, between those things, nearly 10 years have passed, and there's still no child. Now, this whole thing started with God saying, I'm going to make this great nation of you. Well, great nation starts with one descendant. And despite all that God has said up to this point, that descendant had not arrived. And even when he expanded the promise, 10 years have gone by, and there's still no child. And so then we find that in Genesis chapter 16, we see that the faith that Abraham had, that we have all agreed is wonderful, gave way to human strategy. All right? So let's take a look at Genesis chapter 16, verse 1 through 4. Would you grab the mic, please? So while he's doing that, I'll just go ahead and read this. Well, the Bible here says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had bore him no children. She had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abraham, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. All right. Why did Sarai make this suggestion? All right, so I heard she was so desperate for children. And Susie said she was trying to help God. I think both answers are true. And I would also add that Sarai probably wanted to provide for her husband. You know, in those days, which are not terribly different than these days, that a woman who desires to have children but is barren is depressed, feels unfulfilled, feels like she's not living out her purpose. And we see that in a number of different places. You remember Hannah? In the Bible. So the desire is to say, well, listen, as old as we are, I'm aware that God has made a promise. But he didn't really give us instructions. So since 10 years have passed, maybe we're supposed to be doing something. So she comes up with this brilliant idea to have him go in to her maid. Now, have you ever heard of the Newsy tablets? I hadn't either until I began to study this. The Newsy tablets are an archaeological find that consists of, 5,000 clay tablets. They were found in Iraq. And what they did was they outlined the legal process of a society. Now, I'll tell you in full disclosure that these tablets came along a bit after Abram's time, but they were indicative of the social and legal norms and mores of a people in the area in which he lived. In other words, they captured what the habits were of a people, and therefore then reflected how they lived their lives, why they did what they did, how they made decisions, so on and so forth. And they covered things like legal processes, wills, inheritance, marriage rules, adoptions, court proceedings, and things like that. 5,000 clay tablets. And so once discovered, they read those things, and it turns out that some of what you can read in there lines up with what we can read in the Bible. In specific, the idea was that a woman who couldn't have children could give her maid or her servant to her husband for the purposes of having children, and then that the children would become hers. The children would become that of the mistress. And so we see this exactly played out in Genesis chapter 16. Now you may say, well, what's the relevance of that? I might ask you, is that relevant and why? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it is. When you look at it, that's probably a cultural thing that was expected at the time, and so this would be something that was acceptable to her, likely. And I think when we flash forward and look at our own culture, are there things that we're accepting because they're culturally acceptable, but they don't align with what God wants us to do, right? So
That's exactly right. So what Dennis has said is that we can see from this information, and again, wider Bible study. It's important for us to read our Bibles, but I think it's important for us to dive in and look at resources that surround the Bible to help us understand the ancient Near East mindset that we've been pursuing this entire study. And the idea here is that we have found proof that it was socially acceptable, perhaps even socially required, to be able to do just exactly what Sarai did, right? And so it wasn't that she was necessarily trying to help God. It wasn't necessarily that she was trying to manipulate things. It was what was socially done at the time. And again, Dennis makes an incredible point that even today, we are surrounded by cultural norms and social conventions that can guide and dictate our actions. And those actions aren't always necessarily in keeping with what God's will is. Okay? That's a brilliant observation. Thank you for that.
Wouldn't that be a bit like in our society that we adopt children and they take our name? And wouldn't that be some? I mean, it's not the same, of course, but I'm just saying it reminds me of it.
Well, sure. And I think that there's a tangential relationship there. I mean, there are things that we do in society, but, adoption has always been part of human dynamics and family building. And we find that in the Bible. In fact, who's adopted of God? All of us, right? All of us. We are adopted of God, but also born to God at the same time, which is brilliant, right?
Well, and then also the hierarchy of the firstborn comes in pretty strong. And Sarah's seeing that there is no leadership coming from a husband that is a leader, and there has yet to be a firstborn. So that's probably looming pretty big too because of that characteristic of a society.
Yeah, I agree with that. The firstborn, particularly the firstborn son, was an important position, an important fixture in society, and many things in families flowed through that. But we can also see that sometimes God does something different with that. And I'll share some names with you in just a few minutes to talk about that. And so, again, Sarai's proposal reflects the customs that are found in society at that time, and we find that from these Nuzi tablets, that's N-U-Z-I, where this barren wife could provide a servant that was a surrogate. So what I'd like for us to also notice is that all we are told is that Sarai comes up with this idea and proposes it to her husband. What's missing? If anything. they did not pray. They did not ask God. They did not consult with God. They didn't ask God's permission. They didn't make any inquiries of God at all. They just decided that here's what we're going to do to bring about the desired outcome. And so here again, whenever we study Scripture, I think it's important that we ask ourselves those questions. I mean, it's one thing to look at these poor, ignorant Hebrews and why they did so many of the things that they did that were absolutely wrong and unthinking, and ask ourselves, but is that still us today? Do we still make those types of decisions? I mean, whenever you're thinking about doing something important in life, do you go to God in prayer? And, I'm not looking for any answers, but I think it's for us to have a thought process. Do we seek the counsel of God? And I can understand if there would be some who would say, well, yeah, but, right? Because we don't have the Urim and the Thummim anymore. Anybody know what those things are? Casting lots, right? Trying to determine the will and the way of God directly by a response from Him through those devices. God doesn't come and sit down next to us on our beds and have a discussion with us. We pray, and it seems like one-way communication. And it would be a massive chase down a rabbit hole to kind of get into how God communicates with us. And I don't want to do that this morning. But I think that a lot of times we just go with what we think and hope for the best. But the idea is that, especially in times where Abraham had direct access to God and he communicated with him, the absolute thing to do for him, just as it is for us, is to consult God in prayer, and they didn't do that.
I probably don't need this, but they also, I guess as a piece of property, did not consult Hagar and get her opinion on any of this. And the whole thing reminds me of Eve. Sarah made this decision without considering the consequences. She just decided this would be a great idea. And then she's surprised that she's jealous and angry. Like, come on, lady, what'd you think was going to happen? But
yeah, that's actually really good, because I touched on that as well, about the comparison between what Sarai is doing and what Eve did. That's a wonderful, wonderful observation, because the outcomes were equally undesirable. Well, actually, probably more undesirable on Eve's part, but you can see some of these recurring characteristics in human behavior. So Genesis intentionally echoes Genesis 3. Again, both women propose. In both situations, the man listens. In both situations, something is taken, and then sin fractures relationships. So, what lesson can we learn from that? And I would just share with you that the idea is that we ought not just kind of go off on what we think is best, but that we should be prayerful and consult God in all things. Whew, I feel the need to kind of offer a little clarity here, because some of your faces are like, yeah, but how does that work, Lee? And I want you to know I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to tell you what I do. If I have an important decision to make, I'll go to God in prayer. Fervent, effectual prayer that sometimes even involves fasting. Now, because I know that God's not going to come sit on the chair and talk to me, I tell Him, what I'm going to do is to proceed. If you're looking for a specific example, when I first moved from Texas to Missouri, I prayed to God and said, I'd love to be able to go to St. Louis and take up a position with the company that I work for at their corporate headquarters. I don't know if I'm supposed to do it or not, but I'm going to go ahead and do it, and depending on the outcome, I'll let that determine what your will is for my life. And the first time that I did that, the answer was no. I was eminently qualified. There was nobody better for that position than me. if I do say so myself. But it didn't work out. I was not chosen. But in the meantime, I completed my studies and got ordained into the ministry. And then there was a family dynamic that needed to be worked out that worked itself out. 2 years later, another opportunity came up. And I again went to God and said, here's what my desire is. So without anything else that I know how to do, I'm going to apply. And if the answer, if your will is blessing this, then I'll have it. And if it's not, I won't, and that's okay. Second time, clockwork. Everything worked out. Got the position, sold the house, got the money that I needed, bought a new house, and met you guys. And so it worked out. And so that's one way that I interact with God and seek him out in the decisions that I make. But I think it's important that all of us seek out God in every important decision that we make. And see, Sarah failed to do that.
We also have a tool that they didn't have back then. We have the Bible. So we can actually refer to that to see kind of what God expects of us and what God's real design and purpose for different things are. For instance, if we were to make to encounter a decision like Sarai was proposing to Abraham now, and we could consult the Bible, we would see that God's design is for children to be raised by their parents. And in this culture, the child would be taken from Hagar and raised by Sarai and Abraham instead. And to take a child away from a mother when God created that bond without her consent would potentially be against God's design based on what we read. So if we can consult his words and his design now, like they couldn't then, we can hopefully make better decisions.
Okay, I like that. And everything you said, I think, is worthy of consideration. I would share with you, though, just from a different perspective, is that cultures change. And in that culture, that was accepted and acceptable. And I realized that, things without a woman's consent, but, in that culture, her position versus Sarai's position, it was legal, it was authorized, it was just the way that things were done. And I would also point out that, yes, we have the Bible, and this is why we really, really focus on studying the Bible so that we can understand what God's will and way is for our lives. If we would just read it, avail ourselves of it, learn it, internalize it, and apply it, I think that takes us a long way. But I would also point out that they had direct access to God, and he was communicating with them directly. Just as God had condescended to talk to Abraham and say, here's what's going to happen. Let me take you outside, look up in the sky and look at the stars of the heaven. Your descendants are going to be more numerous than those. Well, you can go to that same God who gave you that same information and said, should I do this? And they didn't. So I think the idea is however we access God, whether it's through his word, which is a great gift today, or directly in prayer, or back in those days where they could actually talk to him, certain individuals, you still have to be the one to be willing to avail yourself of God. And the issue here is failing to do so. Because typically, you're going to expose yourself to unwanted outcomes if you don't do that. So then faith waits. God said, I'm going to do this for you. He just didn't say when. And then when we get a little bit overactive and over anxious, and we decide to help God, that doesn't often work, right? Because you're doing so out of sometimes fear, right? And fear manipulates. Faith trusts, but sin can fracture relationships. So I think it's important that we understand the relationship that we have with God and leverage that in all things.
Along the lines of faith, I think another thing too that, at least in my own life, that plays out is God sometimes doesn't answer our prayers immediately on purpose to grow us. And I think we sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, try to push something that shouldn't be pushed.
Yeah.
He's given us space and time to trust him. And that may take a long time to fulfill that, right? And we get hasty. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and I think that this story, this narrative, is the best example of what you just said. How many years total was it from the time that he told him he was going to give him a child and the time that he actually did? "25 years. And at this point, it had been 10 years. But because you remember, we met Abraham, and how old is he? 75. And by the time he had the child, how old was he? 100, right? So do the math, right? So that's how long this took. And so again, be not weary in well-doing and be not weary in your prayer life, because God may not, we have to trust and have faith in God's timing. And sometimes that timing can be longer than what we're comfortable with. But it's important that we maintain our faith regardless. Let's look at point 2. Genesis chapter 16, verse 6 through 14. I don't know if we want to read all of this, but it amounts to the fact that Abram said to Sarah, "Well, your maidservant's in your power. You do with her what's good in your sight." Am I ahead of myself here? I skipped 2 verses, didn't I? 5 and 6. What does 5 say? All right. Well, we know that Hagar that Abraham did go into her. She did get pregnant, and she had a baby. The problem was Hagar got a little full of herself. I can have a baby, you can't. I have your husband's child, you don't. So she got to be a bit mouthy, and that was a problem. So now Sarai, who had this brilliant idea in the first place, is suffering behind it. She's fit to be tied. Who is this woman to talk to me this way? She works for me. I don't work for her. And that child really should be mine, but now she's decided she didn't want anything to do with that child or that woman, and she wants her away. So she goes to Abram and complains, and Abram says, "Well, you do what you want. She belongs to you." So she banishes her. But the Bible tells us that the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness and by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going?" And she says, "I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority." That's important. "Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that you will be too many to count." And then he goes on to say, "You're with child, and you're going to bear this child, and you're going to call his name Ishmael, and because the Lord has given heed to your affliction, he's going to be this type of person, and his hand's going to be against everyone," so on and so forth. And then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?" Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahairoi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. Now, there's a couple of really, really important things that happens here. First of all, who is communicating with Hagar? You say God, you say an angel. Which is it? Yes, sir. The angel of the Lord. Give me the significance of that, young sir. The angel of the Lord, he said.
So in the Old Testament, whenever it says an angel of the Lord or a angel of the Lord, it's talking about an angel. But most, if not every time that I'm aware that it says the angel of the Lord, it's expressly taking the authority of God in that instance, and it's as if God is speaking himself. I also find it interesting that when it says the angel of the Lord spoke to her and appeared to her, her reaction, there's no reaction, there's no fear or anything, or discomfort, or like, who is this person? In my opinion, I think it's a pre-incarnate Christ that appears, because Christ is the image of God and the express image of God. And in this instance, Christ is appearing to her in a physical form, and he's kind of just gently prompting her, "Hey, what's going on?" And she is like opening up to him, and then I think she's also aware that it's God appearing to her at the same time. But
all right. What do you all think of what young just said? You agree, disagree? You said heresy? Of course. These Thompsons. Welcome to my world.
Hey.
I believe that Luke is dead on. Now, whether you get into a pre-incarnate Christ or not, it is at minimum a theophany. Do we know what a theophany is?
I was out late at the fair with a client. She woke me up early this morning. My brain's not operating at like even 60%. So give me a rough line.
A theophany is a manifestation of God. Another theophany is the burning bush, right? Because God spoke through the burning bush. And so it's when God takes on a form, pre-incarnate Christ or otherwise, that represents his presence, right? And I think Luke was dead on when he says an angel versus the angel. We're talking about the presence of God. And that's who shows up. That's important for a variety of reasons, because, again, he had made a promise to Abram about multiplying him. Now there's this child that is Abram's child. And so this angel says that I will multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. That's in keeping with God's promise. Because remember, what you guys journaled just last week, what was the interesting thing about this covenant that God made with Abram? Well, there were many interesting things about it, and so I know I've come up with these questions, and so I'll just give you the answer to the question I'm asking you. It was a royal covenant, which meant that it was something that God said he would do, and it did not depend on what Abram did or did not do. God says, I'm going to do this regardless. Right? So he says, I'm going to multiply you. Well, now this has come along, and it's Abram's descendant, but God has made a promise. And so he now is validating and verifying that promise by saying, I'm going to multiply this guy as well. Now, the idea is that he's not the covenant child. He's something that you did that was outside of the plan. Nevertheless, the plan extends to Ishmael. And so we see that Abram is now recognized amongst a number of religions. The Muslims recognize him. The Christians recognize him. The Jews recognize him because there's a linchpin there, because he's the father of all these different peoples, the Arabs. He's the father of all these different people. And it's because God had made him this promise. Second, God condescends to appear to this slave woman. What do you think about that?
So I'd never heard what Luke said before, and that's cool. I like hearing new things. But I wonder, is that the same as when Moses died and Satan showed up and disputed over his body because of the sin of murder he committed?
I'm sure how you relate.
Well, when we're
to.
talking about, so what I'm trying to work out in my head is it sounds like Luke is saying, and you're agreeing with, that it was actually God when it says the angel of the Lord. But I believe that when Moses dies, Satan shows up and tries to take ownership of the body. And he accuses him of murdering an Egyptian. And there's this conversation between, I believe it's Gabriel, and I believe it says the angel of the Lord, Gabriel, over that body.
Okay, so I would say that that's different because Gabriel is identified. We know who Gabriel is. He's an archangel. So he's not a manifestation of God. He's a servant of God. He's a minister of God. He's one who carries out God's will. That's separate and distinct from the identity of the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is also the one who shows up when Joshua is about to go across the Jordan into Jericho. And there's this angel of the Lord standing there and saying, and he says, are you for us or against us? And this guy says, neither. And he accepts worship, right? That's what the difference between the manifestation of God is, a theophany, and one of God's ministering angels who sent. So I'd say they're different. We can talk about it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it says here, the angel said, I will increase your descendants. That's God.
Agreed. Agreed. Now, again, this is a manifestation. I'm not saying that God in all his glory came down and had a conversation with this woman, but a manifestation. And we see many manifestations of God. You remember the pillar of clouds that led them. You remember the pillar of fire. These are manifestations of God. You remember the cloud and the fog that's in the temple or in the tabernacle where he speaks to Moses, right? That is a manifestation of God. And so that's all we're talking about, is how God is communicating here. And God is communicating with this woman and told her these things. Okay? The angel of Yahweh appears to Hagar. This is a visible manifestation of God. And so, interestingly enough, this Egyptian servant becomes the first person in Scripture to provide God with a name. Not that God needed to be named by us, but she's the first person recorded as someone who referred to God as such. And she says, God, the God who sees me. Right? In Hebrew, that would be El Roy. El for God, Roy for the description of what he's done, which is see me, R-O-I. Right? So she does this. And so then what does God do? He commands her to return. Now, obviously she was being abused by her mistress, but you could also make the argument that she was deserving of it because she was doing a lot of this. Go back. Go back. Because that's your place right now. I've got some things for you to do. There's some things that need to happen associated with my plan. So go back to where you were. That kid needs to come into play, and I'll deal with all of that. But he sends her back. But the thing that we should understand here is how God was condescending and caring and loving of someone who was outside of his framework, of a stranger in the land, of a foreigner, if you will. So God loves all of us. Even though he had a chosen people, that didn't mean that he didn't love others. And so this is an example, his relationship with and his attention to Hagar, and how that all worked out, okay? All right, we only have a few more minutes left, and so I need to get to verses 11 through 16. The angel of the Lord said to her further, Behold, you are with child, you will bear a son. You'll call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of man. I think I read all that already. Okay. 16. Okay. So when we talk about everything that we've read here so far, we have to ask ourselves, are we trying to manufacture God's will? Are we trying to help God? Or do we have the faith to allow God to do what he has planned to do in our lives? And I know that we can get a bit antsy. I know that we can get a bit anxious. Sometimes we think there's a timing that's involved that needs his immediate attention. Sometimes we may be suffering, we may be in pain and hurting, and we want to stop being in pain and we want to stop hurting, and so we need for God to move now. And there's things that we will do rather than trusting God. Now listen, I'm also not suggesting that if there's things that need to be done, that we just sit in our chairs and wait for God to do it for us. I'm not suggesting that either. And it's very nuanced with regard to how we live Christian lives and how we demonstrate our faith. God has given us the gift of discernment. You know, if your house is burning down, don't go into prayer on your knees and ask God to put it out. Leave, right? Preserve your life. You use some common sense. But the thing is to involve God in everything that we do. We should have God on our minds all the time. We should have an open line of communication to him all the time. You guys have heard me talk about the baby monitors, right? You don't turn those on and off. You don't have to press a button. You just have an open line of two-way communication. So we as Christians should always have that with him. And so when we find ourselves in situations where we are in need or where we have a desire or where we just want to issue praise and thanksgiving, God should always be in our minds and our hearts. We should always be involved in praying without ceasing. Have I confused cultural wisdom with biblical wisdom? And that's easier and easier to do today. Why? Social media. Everybody's got an answer. Everybody's got a solution. Everybody's got a theory. Everybody's got a product they want to sell you. I'm getting old now, and people are trying to sell me things to do away with wrinkles. Yeah, well. Anyway. Didn't always have those, but I always had a smile. But anyway, we've all got theories about what should be done in a given situation. Everybody's wise now. Everybody has a podcast. Everybody has a talk show. Everybody has advice that they give. Everybody has these sayings that they manufacture that provide the world with their wisdom. And it's easy to be drawn into those things, especially if the person who's putting those things out there is influential. But why would a Christian leave what God has said? All right, that's where we should have our first affection. That's where we should have our first desire. That should be our first, really, option, is to seek God in all things. And then we want to ask the question, is that do we believe that God sees those that the world ignores? I think based on this, clearly. In the sermon later on this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Because even we as his agents, even we as his ambassadors, can find ourselves stepping over people who need God. I'm going to confess to you that I made a mistake last night. You guys don't know, well, maybe you do know this, but as a person who lives in this house, whenever the fair is going on, people avail themselves of this property in a great way. They just show up and they park and they fill up this parking lot, and then they start going in the back, and all the way back to the fence line, there's cars for people parking. They get out and they go over to the fair, which is terrifying for me. So I was working on some stuff yesterday, and I came out and I just sort of stood on the porch there, and I'm just watching. I didn't say anything, just people are just parking and walking. And there's this one guy who saw me, and he goes to another car, and he comes back, and he comes over to me, and he goes in his pocket, and he goes, "Hey, do I need to give you something?" For the parking, right. And I said, no, you don't.
Oh man, you said $20.
Yeah. And if the word got out that the preacher was out here taking money for parking in the lot, I'd be fired tomorrow. That's the mistake that I made, right? Because here's the deal. He says, "Are you sure I could make a donation?" I'm like, "Don't worry about it. Go and have fun." And he and his family left. And no sooner than he left, I said, "Why didn't I invite that man to come to worship today?" And even me, right? I made a mistake. I did. I should have done that. That should have been part of my interaction with this person, to invite him to church. And it's rare for me to miss that kind of opportunity, but I did, and I confess that. I regret that. Don't emasculate me. I didn't park the man's car, right? But the point of the matter is that we have a responsibility to see those who don't yet see God, because God sees them, and we saw that in his dealings with Hagar. All right. So next time we get together, we see that Genesis chapter 6 ends with an apparent fulfillment through Ishmael. Abram's going to have a child, and that child's going to be multiplied greatly. But God's promise is not going to come through Ishmael. His miraculous provision is going to be upon Isaac. And so we'll get into chapter 17 next week. Thank you for your attention this morning.